Well, first and foremost, I want to thank the Center for Women's Studies and Education for putting this together. I mean, it's such an honor to Roxana to have something like this and to have a year-long series of presentations and conversations about the kinds of inspirations and provocations that her work provides is wonderful. So thank you to the Center, and thank you for allowing us to be a part of it. I also want to thank my graduate students in advance for for allowing me to push them to present in this particular format. When we initially conceptualized this brown bag, I want to provoke them into thinking about intersectionality, because many of them do take that up quite seriously and intentionally and overtly in their work, but others don't as much, but vestiges of that conceptual and analytical framework is very much there. So this is very much a trial for us in terms of creating a conversation amongst all of us that we're working together on this area to see what might be the provocation of intersectionality can enable us to do analytically, methodologically, and conceptually. So let me just do a little bit of reading of what we submitted to the center, and then I'm going to turn it over to my students. So this panel presentation will examine intersectionality as an analytical framework and how it can be utilized for theoretical, empirical, and political work. Inspired by and building on Roxana Ng's groundbreaking work on immigrant women, the panel will address the ways in which race, gender, sexuality, class, age, and migration constitute each other and are imbricated within dynamics of power, subjectivity, and social relations. Intersectionality is an interpretive paradigm that examines, quoting McCall, the relationships among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relationships and subject formations, end quote. It is a powerful approach pioneered and largely elaborated by feminist of color scholars and activists as a crucial intervention to what they deem as limitations of feminist and anti-racist frameworks. More recently, a burgeoning field of intersectional studies has emerged with an intellectual genealogy that consists of 3 distinct yet overlapping tracks. And I'm going to quote here one of the recent ones. It came out this past summer by Sumi Cho, Kimberly Crenshaw, and McCall. And here's how they're thinking about these 3 tracks. First, consisting of applications of an intersectional framework or investigations of intersectional dynamics. The second, consisting of discursive debates about the scope and content of intersectionality as a theoretical and methodological paradigm. And third, consisting of political interventions employing an intersectional lens. As you could probably tell, or eventually tell, based on the 5 presentations this afternoon, that the presentations will be based on one or an overlapping series of these different sorts of tracks. So some of the questions that really animate this presentation include, what are the possibilities and limits of intersectionality? How might it be utilized to analyze particular dynamics, social relations, and sites that go beyond the ways in which it was initially conceptualized, looking at race and gender? How does it exceed single variable analyses that enable the exploration of complexity and multidimensionality? And lastly, what other provocations can it enable us theoretically, methodologically, and politically? So the way that this will work out, there are 5 presenters for this afternoon. Each one of them has been tasked to only go within 10 minutes, so that we have plenty of time afterwards to engage with each other, with their ideas, but also collectively. So the way that this will go, we will have Ken first, then Marissa, then David, Sophia, and Fritz. And then before each one of them, I'll just introduce them in terms of the title of their paper, but also where they are in their studies. So Ken is a 4th-year doctoral student in the Humanities, Social Sciences, and Social Justice Education Department. And his presentation is entitled Embodied and Hidden Discomforts, Power and Marginality in Intersectionality.
Can we continue? My title is called Embodied and Hidden Discomforts, Power and Marginality in Intersectionality. The inspiration for this paper comes from an experience in my life. In speaking about this experience today, I hope to translate this experience in a way that is respectful and can contribute to debates about progressive politics and solidarity. In doing so, I draw methodological and theoretical inspiration from a host of feminist and cultural studies scholars, of which include the namesake of this seminar, Roxana Ng. I speak particularly about Roxana's seminal article, A Woman Out of Control, in which Roxana deftly and convincingly articulated and analyzed an experience she had as an educator in a classroom, where she both confronted and negotiated patriarchy. Drawing from an incident between her and a male student, she reveals how, when faced with a complaint that her pedagogy is with a feminist bias, this very institution, by way of inaction, non-support, and dismissal, reaffirmed so much of what Roxana's work critiqued and protested. The question that drives my paper today centers on how might men, specifically those privileged and marginalized within the context of white heteronormative patriarchy, imagine themselves as a part of feminist circles and enact a type of feminist politics. I ask this question speaking as and drawing from my own experiences as a man myself, who is both racialized, from a working class background, and heterosexual. I want to speculate specifically on the issue of how and when. How and when, against the context of a shared but ultimately differently experienced context of oppression, those with a particular set of intersections of identity might speak or stay silent. How and when might those who benefit and are marginalized by oppression speak or stay silent in order to compel a consideration of a transformative politics among and ultimately beneficial for all? So, the impetus of this paper is autobiographical and uncomfortable. I should explain. A number of years ago, I began to become progressively more involved in Toronto's racialized feminist activist circles. I attended classes in the university, helped to organize, and also attended community events. I began to notice a few things in these classes and these events. Firstly, often, but not always, I would be the only man in these spaces. Secondly, being the only man in these spaces could be an acutely uncomfortable and unsettling experience. An indicative example was a class that I took during the early stages of my PhD, one with an explicit aim to analyze social experience through an intersectional lens. The majority of my classmates were racialized and women. At this point in my life, although I had commitments to the projects of both anti-racism and feminism, it was during that class that, for the first time in my life, I would be pushed by certain interlocutors to consider how I'd both benefited from and both been complicit in the perpetuation of patriarchy. For the first time in my life, I'd learned to consider what it meant to interject and comment with a man's voice, and in a normative, masculine fashion. I felt a certain tension from being the sole male voice in this environment, in a particularly politicized and woman-dominant one, and consequently spoke more tentatively and carefully than I ever did before. Heretofore, in most instances, the relevant social location that I spoke from was from the vantage point of a racialized minority, specifically from a working class background. In this class, I was being asked to think about, performatively, intellectually, and in relation to others, how I spoke as a man. It became routine for me to be subjected to difficult questions and critiques along these lines, and the occasional dismissive stare. My face was often burning. Sarah Ahmed suggests that emotions can have a contagion-like quality, insofar as that they can catch from one person to the next. Emotions, once present, can become suffused throughout a room. If this can be said to be true, this classroom's in question's emotion environment, so to speak, as I read it, was a complex one where palpable frustration shifted and begot anxiety and apprehensiveness. Questions and responses became measured and deliberate. Moods and cadences would often come to a pitch, and no one, after a certain point, was above to using personal disclosures to defensively capitulate a point. To extend Andrea Smith's phrase for a moment, the oppression Olympics were being played out from time to time, and of course, there were no winners. A less generous colleague, herself a self-identified feminist of color who had been involved in the city's progressive circles for the better part of a decade, suggested that without considering my actual perspectives and investments in intersectionality, I was unfairly being singled out as, in her words, the embodiment of patriarchy, albeit a racialized one. My own reading of the situation was different. Stuart Hall suggests that if one looks closely enough, one can always see that there are multiple presences that inform and constitute any social context. Using Jamaica as an example, Hall speaks to how the varying Black, British, and Arawak Indian presences are both historically and in the contemporary moment significant for the island. Speaking to the episode in the classroom, it was not so much an issue of presences being the issue, although there were presences that were significant. But it was much more about, not so much about context, as much as it was about the interactions themselves. What seemed more relevant in this episode for all there was what I tentatively phrase as residues, that which lingered from previous social interactions, which consequently informed the ones that we were having. Speaking for myself, the residual indignation that I so often felt speaking from the social locations of race and class too often lent an affective quality and tone to my statements that I now regret. And if my colleagues' analysis is to be believed, for a select group of my interlocutors in the classroom, the residual and very much justified anger from interactions with men who had sexist and patriarchal views influenced their perception and consequent treatment of me. Of course, the pressing dilemma is that for the foreseeable future, presences and residues will continuously be in play for those of us who would work together for a greater shared social justice. And all of us will approach this work from a variety of different important, affecting, consequential, and multiple social locations, histories, experiences, and identities. Contemporary life is an accumulation of messes, and what we do to work through it, to imagine and realize something better, will be messy work. If an impasse is something we can't afford, then a contingent solution might be to considerately foreground an identity when appropriate, dependent on context, and to understand and act accordingly. For example, related to what I've talked about today, racialized, working class, or otherwise, I should have been cognizant, in the context of a classroom where I was one of the sole male bodies and male voices. Keeping quiet, affording respect, and even some degree of deference to the women present was merely not an option, it was a responsibility. In order to act in a fashion ameliorative of the social factors that preceded, enabled, and necessitated our discussions in that classroom, these actions were baseline requirements. Or in short, in retrospect, I should have more carefully thought through my hidden discomforts, as opposed to compulsively act on them. It should be remembered and reminded, there are instances when a particular set of voices and opinions should more distinctively be heard, as opposed to others.
Our second presentation will be Marissa Largo, who has a PowerPoint that will show some images. And the title of her presentation is Rendering Difference, Identities in Filipino-Canadian Contemporary Art.
Homoerotic silhouettes of men cut from balikbayan boxes dangle from the ceiling like Happy's shells from the chandelier in my parents' home. I am hit with feelings of familiarity and foreignness at the same time, and reminded of my anticipation as I began setting up and decorating the nursery for my son, who arrived last year. For me, this space contains the same feelings of possibility and of hope. This is the domestic space of a family that is simultaneously like and unlike my own. Within the growing Filipino population in Canada, there is an emerging number of young contemporary artists who are responding to their invisibility through their artwork. This paper examines one such artist, Philippine-born Julius Poncelet Manipul. Through photographic manipulation and sculpture, Manipul constructs the living quarters of this fictional child as a symbol of possibility of a racialized queer family in his 2013 installation Through the Looking Glass Inside My Domestic Portrait at the University of Toronto Art Centre. He envisions and creates a narrative that challenges the conventions of religion, family, gender, and race. Through this case study, I aim to address my larger research question. What are the ways in which Filipino-Filipina Canadian artists mobilize art in response to their invisibility in Canadian society? Drawing on the work of Filipino-American scholars such as Martin Manalansan and Sarita C., and post-colonial theorists Homi Bhabha, I argue that through a hybrid art practice and a queer decolonizing aesthetic, Manipul challenges Western heteronormative standards of family structure and gender identity, and in doing so creates a utopic third space of possibility. When I first entered the installation space, I immediately observed the stylized fabrication of a domestic residence. A child's bed, mobile, chandelier, small chair, and table, along with adult-sized furniture, are constructed from balikbayan boxes, the emblematic symbol for diasporic Filipinos, who return with or remit goods back home. This return to diasporic materiality, coupled with the French provincial stylings of the pieces, alluding to his partner's ancestry, represents the hybridization of cultures between East and West and the complicated reconfiguration of home in the age of global migration. For diasporic Filipino gay men, Manalansan contends that everyday life, including relationships with family and home, is, quote, an arena for contestation and resistance against, as well as acquiescence and capitulation to the experiences of cultural displacement and marginality. This constant and difficult negotiation reflects Manipul's central preoccupation in the works of this exhibit. Resisting biological reality, Manipul gives birth to Christian James, the child constructed through a digital amalgamation of photos of himself and his husband. We see Christian James's portrait embedded within the lace-like design of a predominantly black wallpaper. Upon closer inspection, the ornate designs are racist and homophobic slurs, and a repeating image of a flesh wound accidentally imposed by Manipul via art making. These symbols of pain, both emotional and physical, can be read as what Sarita C. describes as, quote, excessive embodiment, which is rooted in a history of colonial violence and loss. These visual representations of injury form a belligerent response to the numbing effects of organized imperial forgetting, end quote. In referring to both the color and dominating culture of the Western modernist gallery, Manipul questions the whiteness of standard contemporary art spaces, spaces to which racialized artists must conform. Viewed as a microcosm for Canadian settler society, Manipul infuses the personal and domestic into the public white space, denoting settlement marked with pain. His wallpapering of this space domesticizes it and reclaims it as his own. In the words of Manalansan, as Manalansan suggests, this, quote, with experiences of alienation and displacement come the experiences of a rebirth or a second chance, or more succinctly, experiences of pleasure and settlement. In Manipul's intervention, things are not just black and white, but they are shades of gray. This highly constructed realm can be understood through Homi Bhabha's conception of third space, that is, an in-between space where differences and affinities are revisioned. In Location of Culture, Bhabha describes the third space as, quote, a present time and a specific space, which constitutes the discursive conditions of enunciation that ensure that the meaning and symbols of culture have no primordial unity or fixity, that even the same signs can be appropriated, translated, rehistoricized, and read anew, end quote. Take, for example, Manipul's appropriation of his marriage license in an all-over decorative pattern that becomes the wallpaper for Christian James's nursery. In this third space, the heteronormative family structure provides the backdrop for this queer family, making it a hyper-visible reality in this context. In his 2003 book, Global Divas, Filipino Gay Men in the Diaspora, Martin Manalansan asserts that Western hegemonic discourses of queerness are becoming globalized. He describes the white gay male gaze as, quote, an omniscient, unreflexive observer whose erotic and practical politics are based on an imagined level playing field for all queers, end quote. For adherents of this belief, any queer space around the world can be declared as home. This is not the case, however, for diasporic Filipino gay men, argues Manalansan, who negotiate bakla and gay cultures, tradition and modernity, and notions of citizenship on a daily basis. This corresponds with Manipul's critique of a homogenizing influence of the white gay male gaze and turns it on its head through the construction of a massive cardboard chandelier that looms over the installation space, from which idealized hypermasculine forms appropriated from Western gay porn are suspended. The light that emanates from it casts shadows of these forms over the space. Here, Manipul acknowledges the hegemonic representations proliferated by the porn industry, but does not allow them to define him. In spite of this presence, Manipul creates his home and family under its shadow, exercising his agency as a diasporic sexual subject. Manipul extends his artistic intervention virtually on the social media platform Facebook. Christian James has his own page, complete with postings of cute panda bears, cartoon clips from YouTube, and pictures of his favorite toys. Julius tells me that as he and his husband age, he will continue to create and update the amalgam profile photos of Christian James. His son will age with time. Intersections of race and gender, as they collide and contest with colonial representations, are evident in Manipul's physical and virtual interventions and represent the creation of a utopic third space. Manipul creates new meanings in this space where representations of family, identity, and citizenship are contested. Art has become a method by which Manipul realizes his utopic vision. Through the looking glass inside my domestic portrait is evidence of an emerging decolonizing aesthetic among Filipina visual artists who are resisting invisibility through their hybrid practices.
The third person that will be presenting is David Pereira, and the title of his paper is Stretching Beyond the Categories That Constitute the, quote, at-risk youth subject.
In this brief talk, I will discuss the importance of employing an intersectional analysis in my master's study, as well as explore how intersectional thinking provokes me to mobilize the innovations and interventions offered by queer theory to begin to question, disrupt, and complicate youth at-risk identity and how we perceive academic underachievement. I first employed an intersectional approach in my master's thesis on a study of how masculinity informs the educational trajectories of Portuguese-speaking and/or Portuguese-identified young men in Toronto. Statistically, the Toronto District School Board categorizes youth of this linguistic and/or cultural background among the highest at risk for early school leaving, characterized by a 34% dropout rate and high levels of academic underachievement. Within this study, I embraced an awareness of how class, gender relations, masculinity, race, sexuality, ethnicity, and other dimensions and modalities inform subjectivities and social relationships. This awareness necessarily informed my analysis of this social phenomenon. What I eventually gained was an appreciation for the significant challenge intersectionality presents in constructing complicated, multidimensional conceptualizations. I made sense of participants' experiences by taking into consideration the socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial, gender, and gender relations and sexuality dimensions of their identities. What I didn't contest, however, and what I am now revisiting my data to consider, is how categorical thinking figures into what interpretations of these young men remain imaginable and, more importantly, unimaginable. For example, at-risk identity and academic underachievement often significantly inform our interpretations of youth stigmatized with these neoliberal categories, aimed to, of course, identify students who need extra help and lift these students out of their marginalized and impoverished realities, whether academically, socially, economically, and so on. But I spoke to youth who complicated the idea of at-risk. Bruno was one such young man. At the time of his interview, he was a 28-year-old, gregarious, attractive, and personable young man with olive skin, dark hair and eyes, and an athletic body. He grew up in an immigrant working-class family and now works in the music industry. Neither of his parents completed high school, and he is the first in his family to attend university, much less complete a post-secondary degree. While he's out to his family, he makes every effort to, and I quote Bruno, avoid the typical gay lifestyle, end quote, even from those who already know. For Bruno and others, one of the ways of asserting masculinity was through being the provider and demonstrating an ability to take care of a not yet realized family. Bruno's dimensions and modalities proved this difficult. Given his attempt to hide his sexuality from family, community, and schoolmates, he certainly wasn't going to bring home a boyfriend whom he might one day marry and even start a family. Nevertheless, his need to prove himself as capable of providing, particularly to his father, concerned him significantly. According to Bruno, the most respect he garnered from his father was not after completing his degree, but instead, it was the day he bought his first house. When I bought my home, although he wasn't supportive financially, I knew that I had just kicked it up a notch with my dad. He had a bit more respect for me because I became a homeowner. Home ownership impacts and informs Bruno's marginalized subject position, class, gender, sexuality, immigrant ethnicity, in ways that neutralize his otherwise, quote, negative identity characteristics in the eyes of his father, community, and social networks. Sadly, Bruno admitted, quote, now that I'm selling my place and decided I want to go back to renting, it's kind of like I got that peg kicked out from under me now. It's like down one again with my dad. What categories, such as at-risk and academic underachievement, reproduce is a refocusing on school behavior and performance for many ethno-racial youth as opposed to their goals and notions of success. Yet these categories don't at all consider or factor, 1, conflicting notions of success, family, community, school, etc., and the tensions this produces in young men. 2, issues of belonging in multiple contexts, again in one's community, school, and home, and how this produces divergent priorities for youth in school. And lastly, 3, identity anxiety, such as internalized homophobia juxtaposed with one's cultural heritage and or religious traditions and so on, and how the mismatch between these realities external to schooling can reveal schooling as an entirely irrelevant to their present and future needs and lives. With its roots based in critical race theory, intersectionality is well suited to bolster and support a theoretical rethinking of youth at-risk identity through queer theory. In this half, I will propose how intersectional thinking and thinkers have provoked me to mobilize the innovations and interventions offered by queer theory to begin to question, disrupt, and complicate the discipline boundaries of youth at-risk identity and discourse. According to McCall, there are 3 approaches to intersectionality: anti-categorical complexity, intercategorical complexity, and intra-categorical complexity. While categorization has been an effective practice both in educational research, consider Ogbou's caste theory characterized by voluntary and involuntary minorities, or Bourdieu's focus on the advantages of appropriating the cultural capital of the bourgeoisie, central to his social reproduction theory. And while categorization has been an effective practice in activism, consider Spivak's concept of strategic essentialism, categorization comes with its consequences, and intersectionality appears concerned with the general oversimplification of categorization, pushes us to always complicate these isolated, decontextualized groupings. Within my study on Portuguese males in Toronto, I was struck by how multiple dimensions and modalities significantly inform their social relationships and subject formations or individual identity. In particular, the interviews with gay and queer-identified men in my study revealed the effects of intersectionality through their reflections on their relationships with family, community, school, and themselves. However, these categories trap researchers, much less educators and policymakers, into categorical thinking that forecloses alternative dimensions and modalities of being. In effect, what I'm suggesting is how might the categorical focus of the 3 approaches to intersectionality, whether anti, inter, or intra, in fact foreclose the possibility of a post-categorical analysis. What might be, as Patty Lather suggests, the generative positivities of stretching beyond categorization that queer theory calls us to consider? Indeed, queer theory calls us to stretch beyond the category of sexuality and gender, or LGBTs, whereas my sense is that intersectionality calls us not to stretch beyond these categories, but to locate the intersections of identity categories precisely to analyze power and structure that maintain hierarchies of domination and systems of subordination, whether it be race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, etc. Both intersectionality and queer theory draw attention to the broader governing relations that maintain systems of subordination. The difference is that intersectionality asks us to consider how to address these issues to bring about social justice and equality, whereas queer theory demands that we question our investments in those systems altogether. In closing, one can certainly sense the post-structuralist paradigm that informs intersectionality through critical race theory and queer theory. What I am particularly interested in is to investigate how a category such as youth at risk can be rethought to emerge its generative positivities that remain invisible and condemned. What do these youth know or not know but sense that we as researchers, educators, policymakers refuse or fail to see? Many of the young men with whom I spoke, including Bruno, were unsure about the benefit of having spent significant time and money on a university education, and many figured that they didn't need it to do what they were doing. I'm reminded of the youth in Michelle Fine's 1991 ethnography of Black youth in urban schools in New York City. The underachieving and at-risk youth in her study were less likely to be depressed, more politically aware, more likely to be assertive in the classroom if undergraded, and less conformist than those who, quote, succeeded. All these qualities, characteristics, and skills are results, in my mind, at least, of a quality education. What investments have we in a category like youth at risk, and whose interests is it serving? Thank you.
By the way, I forgot to mention that David is a third-year student, and he's actually in the middle of his comps exam. He's doing this alongside that.
This is a nice break.
Our fourth presenter is Sophia Papastavrou. She is a fourth-year student in our department. And the title of her presentation is Decolonizing the Cypriot Woman.
Thank you, Roland. I'm actually really excited to be here in honor of Professor Huynh. The study is entitled Decolonizing the Cypriot Woman. This is a working paper that has inspired my doctoral research, and it's actually dedicated to the women's organizations working on the ground in Cyprus who are working tirelessly to make their voices heard. Now, the long-term consequence of the Cyprus conflict, referred to by the international community as the Cyprus problem, rests on the bodies of Cypriot women. In the study, the category Cypriot woman includes women from Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Maronite, and Latin communities living on the island. This study explores Cypriot women's voices across war zones in the documentary film entitled Women of Cyprus, and an interview that I had with Professor Maria Hadjipavrou of the University of Cyprus, who is a feminist scholar and participant in the film. I use transnational feminist theory to address the multiple level perspectives of power relations and as lens to observe the different threads that bind the women together, the sense of home, the love of place, the need for personal safety, the emotional and political price of war, and the personal tolls of the occupation, partition, and genocide for both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots alike. Now, I do not feel that I have the authority to or right to retell these women's experiences, but through this paper and talk, I attempt to critically engage with oral history as a way of decolonizing the Cypriot woman in order to make room for her to speak and to make her visible in both Western and transnational feminist scholarly work. What do I mean by decolonizing? The process of decolonization can be defined as an attempt of the previously colonized to reflectively work out a historical relation with the former colonizer culturally, politically, and economically. I utilize Chen's work, which outlines three major themes of the decolonization process that we can observe in the geocolonial historical Cypriot narrative. These major themes include nationalism, brought forward during anti-colonialist movements, nativism, or revitalization of culture within the categories created by the colonizers, and civilizationism, or the struggle for political cultural justice. I would like to provide some of you with the background on what I mean by the Cyprus problem. Cyprus itself is located in the easternmost part of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1878, the Ottomans leased Cyprus to Britain until independence in 1963. The new colonial power had implemented new laws, institutions, and practices in order to secularize and civilize the island and its people. Both Greek and Turkish Cypriots were named as the two official ethnic groups, and after independence in 1963, inter-ethnic conflict broke out, fueled by mistrust, fear, and political as well as ethnic differences. The removal of British street names, bringing down colonial buildings, and installing a Cypriot president did little to decolonize the country's people, but rather fueled anxiety of cultural loss and the need to preserve ethnic heritage. The role of the Cypriot women as producers and reproducers of the nation in the form of mothers and wives is central in the maintenance of the colonial and post-colonial project. Women become signifiers for ethnic, national, or religious differences and symbols of nationhood. Social structures like the state, family, law, and education regulate women through social markers that are gender-specific. Cypriot women face multiple layers of oppressions by a superior, men, and foreign control, white and Western. In July 1974, civil unrest among the two main ethnic groups alarmed the Turkish government, and 5 days later, Turkey agreed to an offensive to the island and managed the partition of the island by Turkish troops. Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots found themselves on the wrong side of the island and became refugees in their own country. In 1983, Turkey declared the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as an independent state, and new generations of Cypriots were brought up on each side. The partition of the island would be known by the international community and the United Nations as the Cyprus problem, and now a frozen conflict. Throughout the island's history of the female body became the site of discovery, rape, and conquest. The Cypriot woman's body is a physical and symbolic space where the creation of the nation is justified as well as defended. Now, in her work on women in war, Winona Giles argues that there is the public and private distinctions between battlefield and home, soldier and civilian, state security and human security, which have broken down. Feminist analysis of conflict explain that the intimate connections between war, political economy, nationalism, and human displacement, and their various impacts across a larger scale. The body, household, nation-state, and economy all represent the site at which violence can be evoked against people in very highly gendered ways. Now, the history of the island itself requires a feminist lens to take into account the lost, forgotten, marginal, and unspoken voices. The struggle against colonial rule and for independence in Cyprus, according to Vassiliadou, was created by men, ordered by men, and carried out by men. It was a patriarchal struggle on a patriarchal island, which most women followed and became involved. In fact, they were used by men to promote their interests. I would add this is not the first instance in Cyprus history that women's voices have been left out. Women have been left out of most of the island's historical narrative. Then again, human rights have not always included women. Who is the Cypriot woman? I mentioned prior that I use oral history to provide a historical-based approach in research methods. The research on Cypriot women's narratives in conflict and post-conflict conditions can be understood as an active memory based upon past experiences. The oral narrative of Professor Maria Hadjipaglou during my visit to Cyprus in May 2011, and also throughout 2012, brought to the surface the struggles of being a woman, a peace activist, a researcher working at the university. Maria began our conversation with an introduction of her work with a non-governmental organization called Hands Across the Divide. This was a bi-communal NGO made up of Cypriot women from both sides of the island, working together for peace, reconciliation, and women's rights. Maria's research includes sharing women's collective memories and the different narratives constructed by each side to move beyond the us and us versus them binary, and more importantly, give Cypriot women a platform to be heard. Now, Maria reminded me that there have been minorities as well as migrant workers who are oppressed and marginalized as well. There is a need for a multi-communal feminist movement on the island to create the opportunity for all women in the various ethnic communities to challenge the patriarchal order. It is through this dialogue that brings together the surface, the invisible, and the voice of the voiceless. Now, in their film, Women of Cyprus, directed by Vasiliki Katribanou and Bushra Azuz, is a collection of women's oral narratives of their shared experiences of the divided island. This film was created over a 4-year period following Cypriot women. Some were members of the NGO Hands Across the Divide, working towards a bi-communal coexistence. Now, in the beginning of the film, we are introduced to Maria Hajipavlou, who is visiting her home in the northern part of the island that is illegally occupied by Turkish settlers. There, she meets Zahra, and they share their experiences as women living on the island. Now, this film weaves each woman's personal journey of pain when they visit their family home that was lost in the war, and their search for reconciliation and peacemaking within themselves and the other women they meet. The film also provides a forum for women to share their concern of their lack of participation in leadership roles that have been responsible for peaceful negotiations and deciding their future by the international community and Greek and Turkish governments. Embedded in their experiences of conflict is a commonality as well as differences they share as women and the challenges they face in being silenced by their respective communities. The women are not concerned with retribution or revenge or even getting their homes back, but rather they share with me the need to rethink who they are as women, as mothers, as daughters, and their multiple identities that bring them together, and observing the Cyprus problem as a narrative from both sides. Maria Hajipavlou adds that this kind of trauma and violence remains hidden on the bodies of these women, that there are scars that do not leave easily, and some die taking it with them. The pain and violence of the island has been done on all the bodies of all ethnicities. The documentary and interview with Maria Hajipavlou provide an example of who the Cypriot woman possibly is. Though I do not assume that the Cypriot women are a homogeneous group, it is necessary to be mindful of the multiple layers of ethnic identities and how these categories both enable and constrain the Cypriot woman. Transnational feminist theory is a way of understanding women and gender by complicating the notion of unity among women and addressing the effects of colonialism, war, and militarism on women's lives. The Women of Cyprus documentary provide a narrative of how women's dialogue are questioning what Hajipavlou calls the power systems of the economic, the ethno-national, and the sex-gender power, all three intersecting and promoting inequality and are sustained by coercion and violence. Women across these borders of nation-state begin to dismantle socio-political discourses through alternative spaces. In working through the process of decolonization, through their oral history, women of Cyprus have strived to decolonize themselves. To decolonize the Cypriot woman, as Chen suggests, is to free colonizing and colonized subjects from the limits imposed by colonial history, and in doing so, brings visibility to the untold stories and unknown stories of women whose voices have been silenced.
And last but not the least, the last presenter is Fritz Pino, whose paper is entitled, "What Difference Does It Make? An Intersectionality Perspective on LGBT Aging Studies."
In this very brief paper, I foreground the figure of an elderly Filipino gay immigrant subject in order to demonstrate the way in which intersectionality theory, grounded in queer of color lens, can be a useful analytic framework in examining LGBT aging studies. The seniors population in Canada is not only growing, but also of diverse social occasions and identities. This condition has pushed gerontology scholars to attend to the ways in which embodied identities impact later life. Gerontological scholarships then foreground particular types of identities, such as based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, immigration, and ability. While such studies have been instrumental in the development of social services and programs that target particular groups of elders, such as racialized elderly immigrants, elderly with disabilities, elderly women, and elderly LGBT, such studies are compartmentalized and monolithic, that these focus only at one side of difference, where marginalization, oppression, and invisibility can take place, thereby neglecting and obscuring other sites and spaces where oppression can simultaneously occur. My paper therefore engages in such a problematic in the field of aging studies in where there is lesser attention paid to an intersectionality perspective. In particular, I engage in both elderly ethnicity race studies and elderly LGBT studies. Here I look at the figure of an elderly Filipino gay immigrant subject as a way to reveal the way in which race has not been included in examining elderly LGBT lives, and the way in which sexuality is also absent in analyzing the experiences of racialized elderly. To be sure, my investigation of the figure of an elderly Filipino gay man in Canada is not just about advocating for his inclusion as an object of study, but rather, I ultimately aim to bring up and reveal the limits of the dominant discourse that have been produced by centering the experiences of white elderly LGBTs within the field of elderly LGBT studies. Thus, I am reminded of the works of Lisa Lowe in her observation of the elision of Asian actors in modern Americas. Lowe writes, quote, "My purpose of observing the elision of Asian actors in modern Americas is not to pursue a single particularist cultural identity, not to fill in the gap or add on another transoceanic group, but to explain the politics of our lack of knowledge. It is to be more specific of what I would term the economy of affirmation and forgetting that structures and formalizes humanism. This economy civilizes and develops the freedoms of man in modern Europe by relegating others to geographical and temporal spaces that are constituted as uncivilized and unfree. Indeed, while the failure to involve racialized sexual minority elders in research and policy initiatives have been attributed to methodological, epistemological, and logistical issues in research, I argue that such a failure is also connected to historical and political trajectories in nation building that operates through whiteness and heteropatriarchal logics, thereby occluding the racialized elderly queer subject. Racialized bodies are constructed and seen as the other and outside of the nation. Queer bodies, on the other hand, are dumped into the margins and are invisible. Given such context, I used intersectionality for LGBT aging studies based on the vantage point of queer scholars of color who foreground a queer of color critique. Examples of these scholars or works are Gloria Ansaldúa, David Ng, and which Marissa has mentioned earlier, Martin Manelansan, whose works reveal the racist and orientalist discourse of mainstream LGBT studies by foregrounding the racialized, class, gendered, and diasporic experiences of LGBT of colors. Intersectionality framework is useful as it provides the possibility of expanding the analysis of elderly LGBT experiences by taking into account other socio-historical factors. These include factors such as but not limited to race, ethnicity, class, gender, immigration, transnational affiliation, religion, and ability. For example, elderly LGBT literatures consider the current cohort of elderly LGBT subjects in Canada as the baby boomers who are part of the pre-liberation era, that is, those who have lived their youth and young adult lives in a very hostile environment, given that it was prior to Stonewall liberation movement. Such, however, may not be the case of those LGBT subjects or immigrants, particularly those from the Global South countries, who have not engaged in the way in which LGBT identities and experiences are articulated in, through, and by the West. Thus, despite its intent to respond to diversity, or despite these studies aim to respond to the diversity within the backdrop of Canada's multicultural terrain, elderly LGBT studies therefore have included race and immigration experiences of non-white and immigrant LGBT elders. Such inclusion produces a form of hegemony that universalizes the experiences of elderly LGBT as the same, thereby creating invisibility of racialized sexual minority elders within the elderly population. So we see how intersectionality framework opens up conversations by engaging issues of racialization, as well as particular processes and forces that involve in the production of particular identities. These forces may include issues of neoliberalism, homonationalism, globalization, modernity, that queer of scholar critique has pushed beyond the province of sexuality. In other words, intersectionality breaks the singular and fixed notion of identity in order to open up conversations, analysis, spaces, and sites that deem significant in comprehending marginalization and diversity. Intersectionality bridges race and sexuality as well as other categories of difference in order to push for solidarity.
So though we can have a little bit of a dialogue here, I'm going to ask the presenters to turn their chairs around so that they can face the audience. So in many ways, Ken's autobiographical narrative of a racialized man from a working class background helps us think through questions of space in relation to solidarity. Marissa's analysis of an arts installation that mapped out race, sexuality, and diaspora help us make sense of how does one work within and against heteronormative spaces, tropes, and symbolics. David's examination of categories help us think through articulation of subject positions and social relations, also delineating our understandings, investments, and politics. Sophia explores the workings of decolonization in relation to women, bodies, and trauma, in relation to war, occupation, and militarism. Then lastly, Fritz's mobilization of queer of color critique as an extension of intersectionality to generate new analytics in studies of aging and gerontology. So what sutures this diverse and wide range of inquiries, at least for me, is a critical attention to the significance and use of intersectionality in both explicit and less explicit ways, as it examines a wide range of subject positions and sites, such as racialized masculinity, queer homes, at-risk youth, post-colonial women, and elderlies. So I just want to kind of provide the overarching summary because there are many folks who also came intermittently. So how I would like to do this is perhaps get maybe 3 or 4 comments and questions first and kind of let that sort of accumulate. And then perhaps if that's directed to the entire panel or to specific folks, that would be great. We do have plenty of time. And again, there are some beverages in the back if you need to hydrate yourself. So I want to make sure that you folks are okay. So comments, feedback, questions. So we'll start with you and then we'll get 2 or 3 others. And then we'll use that as a starting point and then do another round if that's okay.
I have to go. That's all right. That's all right. It was the lady who spoke about the Cypriot women. And you said it was a dialogue between, in the end, or you wanted to create a dialogue, or maybe I didn't mean that, between the women and the so-called the men, or the patriarchal colonial that is still there. And then you spoke about the narratives of the documentary. Could you explain more about what you thought would be good, what I might be getting at, or what has actually happened? Because that's something that's of real interest to me and that I can visualize happening, that kind of discourse.
So you're asking me if
is there going to actually be, what kind of discussion will happen? Because you did imply that there would be a discussion between those who are creating the situation in which the women are living, a still colonialized situation, and the makers of the film.
Well, what this,
that's a...
Oh yeah, we did. Okay, sorry.
Were the other questions or comments? And we'll let it accumulate so that then we'll have an opportunity for it. Yes?
This pretty much, I guess, relates across the board. We're talking about identities and queer identities, masculine, feminine identities, and there's sort of the gender identities seem to be very fixed. And I was wondering if we're looking at gender theories that see gender as more relational, how that might affect your thinking.
Just want to make a couple of comments. One comment is, and I like all the papers a lot, the presentations. I keep thinking about Roxana and what she would have thought, and I think she would just have so loved to hear about your work and the way that you were thinking and putting things together. So that was my first thought. And the second one was, I love it too, and what I especially like about it is that there's sometimes a way in which work in intersectionality becomes this sort of additive exercise. That you work at this category and then this category and this category. And what I could hear in the way that you're sort of challenging yourself to work with it is the much more fluid. So it's not as if you kind of layering one thing on top of the other, but that there are these interruptions and things that are shifting and bringing a very complex sensibility to the questions that you're asking. So, great.
So we'll take those two. One is directly to Sophia in relation to conversation about the film and the possibilities of decolonization. And then whoever might want to take up the question of, gender and feminist theory at this point is really think about, identities in a much more relational way, and how might we consider gender identities much more fluid, and how might that change the ways in which you folks think about gender. Does that capture the two? And then Kari's comments is, that would be great. So,
Sure. I actually would like to speak or email you later if that's more of an interest, because there is so much to talk about in terms of what the film actually did for the island. Now, particularly the women that were interviewed, that were captured throughout the documentary, were women working in the grassroots organization, Hands Across the Divide. And what that did was it actually recorded their voices. And it was shown across the Middle East and also came into North America and highlighted, in a sense, this very tiny little, almost quote-unquote insignificant island in the Eastern Mediterranean, and brought their voices to the surface. And it's actually created a dialogue of what's happening, and even their own personal experiences throughout the conflict in 1974, what that did in terms of displacement, both internally and also what it did to their families. It broke families apart. And what that did was actually bring families who had been lost over the span of almost 40 years to the surface, and they were actually able to reconnect through this film. So the impact that this film had itself has been really profound, and I feel like I don't really give it justice in 10 minutes, and I definitely don't give it justice in the 5 minutes to respond, but I would be happy to share more about it with you. Yes, thank you.
thoughts and comments on gender theory?
You guys are looking at me. Okay, I'm gonna go first about gender, since I'm talking about queer identity, Filipino immigrant identity. And I know Marissa mentioned a little bit about Martin Manalansan's work on Filipino gay identity, which termed as the bakla identity, which is also a gendered identity in terms of the way gendered identity in terms of the way it is being performed in relation to other queer identities in general. So I think I am also seeing the complications of intersectionality theory in really working around it theoretically and methodologically, because there is also a tendency to miss other opportunities of conversations, like the gender, for example. Like in my work, I'm looking at race and sexuality and aging. But at the same time, I should there is a particular neglect, an unconscious neglect of gender. So, for example, elderly gay men, for example, we can also immediately think about the intersection of elderly gay Filipino men, for example. We can immediately think about the intersection of race, sexuality, immigration, and but then gender, right? So I think it is also then important to really think about that category, and also in terms of how it is being performed in a particular context, because it doesn't necessarily reveal whether, for example, our common idea or narrative about gay men is that they are also performing masculinity because of their masculine body, but when we think about other sorts of identities, like the bakla identity, it's more nuanced and more and not fixed because it varies. It doesn't necessarily they identify as like a masculine gay man, but it varies in various contexts.
For me, this was a struggle. In writing this paper, it was like a struggle with semantics. Like, how do I phrase male, man, masculine, and being very cognizant. I mean, I didn't explicitly state outright what your comments directly address, but yeah, I very much take to heart as to the innovations by gender theory and the fluidity among these categories. But after a certain point, especially in the context of a 10-minute paper, it was just. But in all seriousness, I read my paper. I'm like, what am I saying here? Man, male, masculine,
We have language.
right, and the language enables us, but also constricts us at the same time. So it was just like, how do I convey this episode and try to say right.
We'll take the next round of 2, 3 questions, comments. So we'll take 1 or 2.
One isn't a specific question, I just want to respond to what you said. Something that really stood out to me when Marissa said that the white gay male gaze being omniscient, homogenizing, and hegemonic, and I think what is truly valuable in intersectionality is that bringing in all these different ways of looking at who we are and subject positions, it almost undermines that gaze, and especially with the backlight identity, it introduces different ways of understanding gender within different racialized communities, and that in itself is kind of undermining that masculine, feminine binary. So I think when we look at intersectionality, that in itself undoes a little bit of that gender category. If that makes sense. Because to me, that's the very Western construct.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our presentations and the productive use that you're making of intersectional theory. And I was wondering, it also made me think about some of the recent critiques of intersectionality. And I was wondering, because I could kind of hear that a little bit, some of the limitations perhaps, especially of David's presentation, but maybe some of you want to speak to that as well. And so maybe if you're familiar with Jasper Kaur's critique, that it reifies the categories that it's trying to also question. And I guess this is also related to kind of the reification of gender. So I wondered if you wanted to speak to that, perhaps do you find, and I'm not too convinced of the critique, so I'm actually trying to wrestle with it myself. So, so I was wondering, what were your thoughts on it?
Are there 2 others that we could use cumulatively and see? Okay. Let's hear from folks who we haven't heard from.
I can start to kind of speak. I'm also struggling through intersectionality is very attractive and it's for many investigations very useful, and the thing that I'm most curious about is what is missing in these sorts of analyses. I mean, intersectionality, I think its appeal is it's linked to the material lives of the people that are being talked about, that are being kind of exposed. There are multiple identities, there are multiple categories that are being used to kind of talk about their material lives. But in using those particular categories and lenses of analysis, how are we missing, or what might we be missing in terms of really investigating, like I said in my paper, our investments in these categories and our investments in the structures, institutions, and organizations that actually perpetuate the use of these categories. Like I was thinking in Fritz's paper, for example, like what what are the implications of an intersectional analysis on elderly, racialized, and LGBT folks? And I'm thinking, well, for health studies and health policymakers, what then becomes constructed as the good racialized queer subject, right? The good racialized queer elderly subject. And then and who gets left out, or what practices, or what modalities get left out of that category and therefore get excluded and then get marginalized, and you know, other implications of that, whether it's service provision, etc. So I'm still struggling through it too, but that's.
I just started reading about queer theory in relation to Filipino diasporic studies, but from my initial readings, I think that the language of intersectionality is very much embedded in Western epistemologies. So just to go back to what Manalansan was saying about bakla cultures and how it's very fluid, that for diasporic Filipino gay men, senses of identity and senses of home are not universal. So there's like, I'm just reminded of one anecdote in Manalansan's book where a Filipino gay man is egged on by his white friends to go to a gay bar, and they're like, oh, this gay bar is so fun and it's wonderful, and you'll meet lots of great people. And he goes, and he has this very uncomfortable feeling, and so his friends say, what's wrong? Why aren't you enjoying yourself? He's like, oh, there aren't any macho men in here. So the idea of like the homosexual identity is very much a contextual and specific to a Western context. So looking at these diasporic notions helps me to complicate these notions of intersectionality, these categories that are still very much embedded in our language. So it helps to read scholars from different perspectives.
Other questions, comments, feedback? We'll take one. Are there others?
Okay, I came in late and I apologize for that, so I'm not going to ask any specific questions, but I'm a master's student and I'm just getting started on my research, and I was wondering if you guys could offer any advice to someone who might be wanting to incorporate intersectionality into their studies.
Are there others?
Yeah. So Ken, you talked about how you struggled with negotiating that space in the classroom here, and I was just wondering, because I know you're teaching now, what sort of feedback or advice, or, and I'm asking for advice, in constructing a classroom where intersectionality is taken into account, and where everyone is aware of having to be aware of the space and the people in it, and what they bring to the classroom, because I know I've read a lot of studies on teacher candidates of color really being silenced and being used as teaching tools. So how do you deal with that?
Maybe I'll try to follow on this point. One thing that I find in thinking through intersectionality is that it's very powerful in thinking about trying to understand experiences, notions of subject formation, and making identities more complex. I'm also very interested in thinking about like how to work with intersectionality and thinking about the sort of conditions and institutional arrangements and practices. I work with Foucault, so I'm trying to bring Foucault and intersectionality together in order to think about the formation of knowledges, and like so looking not so much directly at the subject and what individual subject might reveal about themselves, but look at the conditions and practices that provide the categories that I think, David, you alluded to it in your presentation, to the at-risk category, for instance.
So on one hand, we have some interest in terms of sort of pragmatics of research and teaching. And on the other hand, we also have, an interest in terms of, since intersectionality is rooted in terms of the personal experience and using that as a place for the theorizing, what might be then the possibilities of putting that in conversation with other questions about the larger conditions that might structure those experiences. So both the pragmatics and the sort of knowledge production sort of questions. Take it away.
You had asked about advice in using intersectionality in your research. I think just if I could offer any advice, it would be to be mindful of, on one hand, intersectionality, for me at least, offers an understanding of these personal experiences, a way of making, and in particular for me, women of Cyprus, giving them a voice and understanding their multiple identities. But on the other, and also their experiences in conflict, which is my primary interest, conflict and post-conflict. But at the same time, to be mindful of using intersectionality to understand multiple oppressions, at the same time be mindful of what it's not doing in your research. What does it constrain? So it enables one thing, but it may constrain another. So just to be mindful of that. And also in terms of these multiple categories of if you decide to study, to choose a particular group of people, and they're sharing with you these personal experiences, some might not identify in the way that you think that they're going to, which I think all of us sort of alluded to, and to be mindful of that in using this particular methodology.
I guess I can speak to Eunice's question. More broadly, the entirety of social theory that I've been immersing myself in, but intersectionality particularly, it's helped me reconcile, especially being on the other side of the classroom, employing different voices according to context. So just explicitly knowing that I can draw from different social locations as necessary to address various issues in the classroom, and to simply connect with the teacher candidates that I have to speak to about these issues. And I don't think it's ever, at least for me, I recognize that it's never going to be a settled process, and there's never going to be a definitive answer as to how to approach this issue today. Because, Roland made this joke a couple of years ago, sometimes you just have to turn off the radio because something's going to piss you off, right? And sometimes you don't have the right response for someone who says something problematic, and how to engage this in such a way that is mindful of absolutely everyone in that space. Because from what I've seen, the same things that we are debating today and what we've all seen reproduced in a particular social context happen in places that still have a particular type of rhetoric that say this is going to be good here. Well, it doesn't exactly work out that.
Either both the pragmatics of research and teaching, or the larger question of knowledge production.
Well, I am kind of thinking about that connection with institutional arrangements and practices, and need to think about it more. But I'm just wondering, I'm working right now with the TCDSB around.
For those folks who might not know the acronym.
The Toronto Catholic District School Board, and they have they started this community outreach Partners in Motion work to reach out to the Portuguese-speaking and Spanish-speaking communities. That resulted in some sort of action plan and striking community advisory groups for each of these groups. And in meeting the other day, there was this emphasis on the place, the role that parents and family play in education, in in bolstering and supporting the work of schools. And we had to reinforce the point that students are in school from 8 to 3. They are, or 9 to 3 or whatever. They're there in school, and during those hours, we're not talking about family, bolstering their educational, success and development. And I think this kind of might speak to, if you look at it through intersectionality, the various challenges and Western kind of normativities around what a family even looks like at home and what resources are at home for those children, and then kind of assumptions get made about how the work of the school can be supplemented or even just complemented by what's going on outside. That just kind of struck me as perhaps part of the institutional arrangements and practices that are assumed and need to be troubled, and perhaps intersectionality can do that.
Yeah, okay. I'm also thinking about, so in terms of, so sorry, I'm not teaching, so I can't comment. And in terms of perhaps the advice for scholars who are working on intersectionality, I think it's also intersectionality in itself is important to really think about the genealogy of intersectionality, why intersectionality has emerged. Thinking about critical race theories, why there was a need for intersectionality understanding on that particular period of time. Politically, intellectually, I believe that sometimes intersectionality could also be taken up in various ways just because it has a particular utility. Politically, there is a specific historical trajectory of intersectionality, which is very much about critical race theory understanding. Crenshaw talked about that in her presentation 2 weeks ago. So that, and then in terms of Carrie's question, I'm taking the Foucault right now, so I'm trying to make sense of this, so I can't escape. But
Full disclosure.
Yeah. So I'm seeing two things here, institutional production of the subject versus the subject's personal experiences, and in what way intersectionality can enliven or in what way intersectionality can engage in both ways. But I'm also, it's a very complicated process because of the fact that first my understanding of these two things is dialectic. They are intertwined, and the production of the subject and the ways the subject voices his or himself is also a product of various scripts and understanding of the institution and regulated by the institution. So we have the disciplined, docile subject. But also, and also the fact that power, according to Foucault, is also circulates. It's also a form of tactic. It is not really a top-down model, but it also comes from the below. So everyone can experience power. And also power is also dialectic with resistance. People who actually performs power is also capable or engaging in some sort of resistance. So I think intersectionality bridges our understand. Intersectionality should not just be based on these conditions. I think it would be useful for intersectionality to bring in other types of discourses and theories to really think about the ways in which social structural conditions and subject formations and voices of the subject, and also the power relations that is going on there, could actually produce a particular type of understanding about social injustice, in particular, social inequalities. Following Gayatry's Spivak's strategic essentialism, I think, is also really helpful in thinking about contextualizing intersectionality and the dialectic of these forces. So I think
Let's take the next round of questions, comments, feedback. So we'll start with you, and then we'll piggyback with the rest.
I just want to kind of continue from what you left off. I've just only been interested in intersectionality and just did some research in the Anglican College Trinity here at university. So my whole doctoral work was dealing mainly around issues of intersectionality, but as it relates mostly to, say, being female in the church, in this case in the Anglican denomination, being an immigrant, and the issues related to theology, that actually the whole decolonization thing would have been a piece in that. So the discussion this afternoon really has me to kind of widen that, but I'm always wondering sometimes, like, even in terms of the call for papers and other things around intersectionality that I read about the missing piece of religion. Because I think even as I listen to the different voices this evening, I kind of think that religion, especially Christian religion that I know of, can help play an important role. Any conversation about religion play an important role in all the other aspects that we mentioned this afternoon.
So if I may, only because it seems like we're thinking along the same paths, and I'm questioning not so much religion but spirituality. And say, so what was missing for me? I only heard three of you, but I'm particularly interested in being in the classroom. I assume you did your training here, and being in the classroom in a city like Toronto, where that is your job. I mean, all the knowledge production that happens there is trying to make everyone feel at home. To what extent, then, all of this intersectionality model, and I'm using it myself, just so you know, how do we then, do we need to start a movement or something? Like, what do we do?
In relation to
making it practical, to making, to just giving words to teacher candidates and the students themselves. And especially in bringing up that sort of missing spirituality piece around identity and looking at your identity in relation to what you're doing in schooling, period.
So I have maybe another missing piece that I want to throw out there, because this question is motivated by my social position as someone who personally doesn't have a stake in any particular marginalized group. I'm pretty much, like, where my social identities intersect is pretty much in the hegemon. But I'm deeply concerned about all the kinds of things that this kind of work and other related work is bringing up with regards to social justice. So what I'm always wondering about is how we bring people on the other side, who are typically the oppressors, into this discussion to help move the discussion of the marginalized groups towards this kind of social change that we all want to see. Because I think something that gets lost in, say, feminist discourse is often where men fit into the revolution.
So if there's a way for us to make sense of this in relation to, intersectionality enables us to look at multiple categories and subject positions, but in some ways there are some foregrounding and backgrounding even in that kind of work, right? at least as Fritz sort of highlights genealogically, coming out of particularly Black feminist thought, the particular attention to race, class, and gender are the primary sort of categories under which this was mobilized. Now, as we sort of expand to address, sexuality, migration, spirituality, how do we do this? At least what I'm hearing from both of you is, how do we do this work that is both inclusive but at the same time looking at how these are working out simultaneously, right, in the kind of social relations, conditions, and subject positions that we all embody. Then on the other hand, what does this mean in terms of solidarity work, and what are the possibilities of intersectionality to inform solidarity? I guess I'll kind of reframe it that way.
I can speak to my experience as a teacher in the Toronto Catholic School Board, and being one of the very few racialized teachers in a predominantly Asian school, Asian Canadian school. My colleagues will often come to me as kind of like a go-between, like, oh, why do so many of the Filipino students want to go into nursing when they're such amazing artists? So there's all these questions that my white colleagues will ask me. So in terms of solidarity work, I see myself as a go-between where I can provide some cultural context. And to speak to your question about student-teacher candidates, there's a lot of talk in the curriculum about having a culturally responsive curriculum. How do we bring that into the classroom? A lot of the pedagogy in my school revolves around student-centered education. So a lot of our pedagogical methods come from students providing their own narratives of family, of home, of religion. So making the curriculum centered around their personal narratives is one way of bringing all of these discourses into predominantly Western curriculum.
How about others?
The role of spirituality, the role of solidarity work. I tend to not use the word ally, so let me just be very clear in terms of why I don't use certain terms.
Go ahead.
I can actually just speak to in terms of the issue regarding solidarity and making room for people to get together. And I think if I could offer just one piece of our suggestion anyway, is the dialogue. Dialogue itself, it's something perhaps that many of us might take for granted. It's something, it doesn't offer solutions to problems, but dialogue is quite crucial. And I saw that in March of 2013 when I attended the Gender Advisory Team's conference in Cyprus, and it was basically men and women scholars presenting their experiences of the conflict since 1974, and specifically engaging in feminist theory. And it was something that the international community, because the conference was funded by the United Nations, and it was specifically addressing the United Nations Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. I won't talk too much about it, but you have a sense of what it was about. And it was interesting to see the NGOs on the ground and the United Nations community, and most of them are from the Western world, coming in and sitting down at the same table and being engaged and simply listening to these stories that otherwise usually go sort of overglossed in terms of policy making. So that is one way, and I think we shouldn't take that for granted, that idea of dialogue, because it does open up discussion, participation, work, in terms of whether it's through a conference or a workshop. I think that's part of the piece, an important part of the piece.
I can speak to both comments in different ways. I think in relation to issues of religion and spirituality, there's been, especially more so in the past few years, more work about how religion works with intersectionality in terms of, and I think there's work coming out of our department with George and Jyoti to some extent. I think it's George Day and Jyoti one to some extent, where they speak about spirituality in school. But I also think of the work of someone like Saba Mahmood, who speaks about, like in a more critical way, thinking through how
certain conversations about religion are framed by, in certain ways that don't take into account the day-to-day negotiations of these things. And her book is The Politics of Piety, I believe. To speak to the question of solidarity, which effectively was what sort of drove my paper, to riff off what Sophia just said, it is important to keep a dialogue, and to also, I just thought of, there was and you can find this on YouTube, there's this really wonderful black spoken word poet, and I forget his name, but he does this wonderful piece where he talks about how we are our Father's children, but we are not their lives, so to speak. And I sort of...
Daniel Beatty?
Yes, yeah. So Daniel Beatty's piece is stunning. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful pieces. And it sort of encompasses, in my mind, sort of what I'm trying to work through, at least from my own position that there was a reason why it was called Marginality and Power. And you just sort of have to keep going through this type of work with some degree of self-introspection and persistence. Right? And I mean, I guess a coda to the paper that I gave, I sent a text message to one of my interlocutors earlier this morning. So there is a moment where you can actually achieve a space where people can speak to one another. And it's if you are engaging specifically with people who are in positions of power, it helps for me to sort of do the self-location thing immediately and to speak through, this is where I stand vis-a-vis, but also articulate quite clearly what they're trying to get out. Does that make sense in some way? And you're not, there's no guarantees here. You're not going to, I think when you get involved in political causes, or at least I sometimes go at it with a particular zeal of, and forgive the phrasing, conversion to some extent, but that's not necessarily going to happen. But it isn't about the win-all strategies. It's actually Jasbir Puar who talks about how, I think it's Jasbir Puar who talks about how, against the context of everything, of all the oppression that happens around us, it is really those moments where we can find moments of solace and solidarity in the most inconsequential ways that actually can be the most powerful impetus to keep going and doing what we do. And it is, at least for me, it's rather remarkable that I can tell the story of in speaking to this narrative today, one of my interlocutors, we actually get along now. So that's a big deal.
I just wonder about when dialogue goes from multi-directional dialogue to unidirectional dialogue, and I think that, so I just think about that and the idea of who's guiding and setting the agenda in a lot of work, and when that gets how the balance needs to be shifted, and that's crucially important when you're doing work around social justice, equity work. So I don't really have much to say about that except to offer it and put it out there. But also that, putting you on the spot, Roland, but Cypriot brought Luke, researcher, academic from Australia who does a lot of work with Aboriginal communities around Aboriginal youth education. And his response a lot of the time around solidarity work is when, for lack of a more eloquent way to put it, when you're not welcome or when your place is not quite to be included yet, it's like, well then step back until the moment is where, where the possibility exists for, for support from outside or whatever the right way to put it is, but kind of like noting when the opportunity exists and when the need is also for space for whatever community. I remember him saying that when he came last year, and I thought that was really insightful.
We'll take the last round of comments and questions because I also want kind of create some time at the end for you to interact with them much more individually and informally. And so if we have the last set of comments, questions, feedback, we'll take these two. Any last ones? This would be it. All right, so we'll take these last two.
I was at the meeting last Thursday. There was a meeting, a big meeting, with a lady, Sharon, I remember her first name, from P, and it was a meeting about inequality, injustice, and it includes homelessness. And one woman, I didn't get to, because nobody answered her question, and I'm asking it today. Can we have a dialogue about gender? Because in order for we address inequality, colonization, you can't leave that one out, because it's still here with us in Canada. Can the mainstream, because in order for things to change and include, as you're talking about, intersectionality, and you're in this little category, you're this, can we all talk about gender first? Because I think that's the big one. If the mainstream Canadians don't start to look at gender and equality and injustice, how are you as institutions making policies and addressing the children in school and families? How are you? So it's the gender we need to talk about first. How it plays the role in Canada. All these centuries, all these years.
I'm just wondering, there's so many identities and so many lenses that we have to look at things from. And they just get piled on and it can be very intimidating. How do you deal with that? At what point do you stop? Because somebody's going to get left out somewhere. You know?
Actually, that might be a good place to maybe get a comment from all of you in terms of, certain kind of prioritizing of certain kind of positions. What do we do with the multiplicity and heterogeneity of not just identities, but also politics and commitments and sites and conditions. So perhaps I'm going to ask in the order of your presentation, if you don't mind, so at least we can have a certain kind of flow. And this would be your final comments, and then we'll just open up for the rest at the end for just some informal mingle.
Big question. So for me, when I think of intersectionality, I always do get back to that larger system of oppression that we speak to, right? And then even in the phrasing where it's like white heteronormative patriarchy. And so just to explicitly say that for me is sort of like this continuous reminder of, yes, everyone speaks from different social locations, but there is a hierarchy in which the way this world operates. And so that's what I was really trying to say with my paper, is that yes, I can continuously speak to multiple social locations, and yes, I can be aggrieved, and yes, perspectives are important, but there comes a certain point where you have to step away from your personal set of experiences, because you're not speaking about your personal set of experiences to change the world, right? I mean, like, it's a larger context in which we're all trying to do revolutionary work. So to some degree, and maybe this can speak to explicitly, like the idea of foregrounding gender, I mean, that is necessary to say outright that, we can speak to different social locations, but according to the law, and it's hard, right? Because there is a certain point where we do get general, but we can point out these general incidences over and over and over again. Do we risk, I think, what you're gesturing at, the idea of collapsing under like the intimidation of trying to speak to everyone? Yes. But, the way Roland phrases it, and I like this a lot, is that we can make small interventions. Right? And small interventions eventually become cumulative. And we can't do everything with every single thing that we do, but these little things eventually add up into a larger conversation and a larger way of reimagining the way people get together and speak to one another.
When I look at the work of Julius Manipul as a diasporic Filipino gay man, working within a very white mainstream contemporary art system, I see it as his interventions as a part of a larger struggle of racialized, sexual minority
individuals who are in a common struggle. There are common commonalities, common experiences of racialization or gender oppression. So when we look at a particular case study or population, I think there are commonalities to these individual experiences that have implications for other communities.
For me, I mean, I think Crenshaw talks about the matrix of oppression, and it's not meant to be simple. Although I will say that gender, and gender thought of as relationally, and not as these static categories, is perhaps among the greatest. Not to prioritize or, but certainly gender and thought of relationally informs a lot of the categories and identities that we've been talking about today. So I hear your point, and I'm certainly on the same wavelength. But the fact is that there's intersectional work, and intersectionality is very difficult to do. And I think that it's done well, often, but it's very often done poorly too. So it is overwhelming purposefully because the work is overwhelming, and I think it takes a commitment to considering the demands of intersectionality and the reasons for it. And like Fritz was saying, genealogically, like the reason for intersectionality in every stage of the research every stage of the research design. And so, whether that's in your questions, whether that's in your methodology, whether that's in your data collection and your analysis, I think that having that present at the forefront of one's thinking is a way to at least not get lost by all those categories and identities that necessarily come up if you're doing intersectionality well. But it's overwhelming, and it ought to be. I think that's my impression anyway.
Thank you for Sophia. I actually thought that was a really important question, especially as researchers and graduate students. When I'm engaged in this type of work, I'm always mindful of asking the question, what do I want to know? And what are the limitations of doing this kind of work? Specifically, I had shared with you the specific ethnic groups that I'm looking at, and there are multiple locations and multiple identities. But I'm also aware of who I'm leaving out. And it's also important to address that and what it doesn't do. And I think I mentioned that as well today, is to be mindful. What is it doing and what is it not? And can I look at it in a different way? And so using intersectionality as a tool to understanding these multiple identities, oppression, specifically for my interest, it's colonization and the impact of it, as well as decolonizing women. So that's important to ask. So what do I want to know? And being cautious that perhaps what you do want to know is going to limit others, limit people and limit others, or what have you, leave some people out. So it's also being mindful as well to that.
My final thoughts. But also, maybe like the question about gender is very much connected to the question about solidarity. I'm thinking I'm trained, my background is social work, and I know in social work we are trained to really have this kind of thinking of offering possibilities and hope, to really thinking about you should have a particular recommendations as a form of intervention so that this particular individual or community or client that you're working can move, and also in social justice work, we should also think about that the ways, like how can we, we should also think about that we should not jump too quickly to moving and intervening and recommending, because that might also omit the struggles of people who are still on that particular, marginalized situation. So there are these tensions of recommendation that might also tend to fix the struggle and also to limit the actual experiences of people. And also in social work, there is the anti-oppression theory, and in that theory, people, we talk about different sides of oppression, either with gender, things that are missed out, like spirituality and religion. And also, people may also have different entry points of really understanding subjection or subjugation. I am reminded of the works of critical race scholars to really think about what are our shared experiences of subjection. Sometimes I felt that people who are marginalized based on their particular identity, like sexuality, hopefully they could also understand the marginality of other people based on a particular identity, like gender or sexuality, hopefully. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. It's not a straightforward understanding. So shared experiences of subjection, perhaps also a little bit nuanced. So my comment or my final thought would be just a question. Because I am not really into fixing and everything. So in what way we can do solidarity work without omitting difference?
And I think that's a really good question to end with, and I really want to invoke Roxana Ng at this moment, particularly since her pioneering work on immigrant women, starting from the late 80s, really enabled us to think about the complexity, intersectionality of race, class, gender, migration, and labor in ways that are quite new and different in the Canadian scene at that particular moment. And I would also say that intersectionality is one of the most powerful intellectual and political analytics provided by feminists of color. And I think we have to acknowledge that kind of genealogy in terms of the ways in which we mobilize it, the ways we critique it, and how do we extend it. So as we grapple with intersectionality as an intellectual and political framework, how do we build upon and extend this work in a way that is mindful of its possibilities and promises and its limitations in a way that doesn't ultimately just destroy that altogether, but really push to think about experiences, subjectivities, and conditions that can really enable new imaginings of futures.